Good evening. Welcome. My name is Roxani Krystalli, and I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's event on Hello Stranger with Will Buckingham. Paisley Book Festival is now in its third year and has been developed as part of Future Paisley, which is a radical and wide-ranging program of events, activities, and investment using the town's unique and internationally significant cultural story to transform its future. Since 2022 is the year of Scotland's stories, the theme of this year's festival is Stories Mac as we ask both authors and audiences to reflect on the transformational power of stories in our lives, how stories shape and reshape our identities, and offer us support through difficult times. If you haven't already, please do go online and check out the other events on offer. Following the success of the digital festival in 2021, which I was delighted to be part of, this year's festival takes on a hybrid format, with many events taking place live in Paisley, whilst others, like this one, are streaming digitally on our YouTube channel. All digital content is free to access, but if you're in a position to donate to the festival to help us put on more events like this and support reading and writing in Renfrewshire, please visit paisleybookfest.com/support. That is paisleybookfest.com/support. And you can also check out our online festival bookshop at bookshop.org, which supports independent bookshops throughout the UK. And it's stocking Will's book, which we'll be talking about tonight, as well as all the other books on display at the festival. Finally, if you're on social media, give us a follow at Book Paisley on Twitter, Paisley Bookfest on Instagram, and a mention with the hashtag PBF2022. With the announcements out of the way, I am delighted to welcome Will Buckingham to our conversation tonight, whose book Hello Stranger was published by Granta in 2021. Hi, Will, how are you?
Hi there, very well, very nice to see you.
It is so nice to see you, and welcome to our audience joining us from far and wide tonight. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat box if you're joining us on the platform, on the YouTube chat, or on social media throughout the event. Don't just wait for the Q&A, and we'll fold them into the conversation. So, Will, I was delighted to read Hello Stranger for a number of reasons that we'll get into during the conversation. But one of them was the premise. One fascinating part of the book for me was the idea that we need not only friends in times of grief, but also strangers. Could you tell us a bit about that premise and how it came up in your life?
So, the book, I've been interested in the idea of strangers and what strangers bring us in our lives and the difficulties and challenges, but also the rewards of connecting with strangers. And the thing with strangers is that's most people. I mean, we have our circle, the circles of people we know are very small, and most of the 8 billion people on the planet are strangers. So we're not going to escape them, and they're always there, and they often present us with interesting problems and challenges, but also new possibilities as well. So this is something I've been interested in for a long, long time. But I think it really came home to me, and the book really grew out of the death of my late partner, Ellie Kirk, in 2016 of breast cancer. And in the aftermath of that, and the book starts with the experience of grief. And I think grief is interesting because it's also incredibly individual. So I should preface this by saying I don't think there is such a thing as how grief should play out. And I think that every individual grief is as unique as every individual relationship for which you are grieving. But certainly after Ellie died, I felt a sense of almost futurelessness. And I think that's the way I came to see it. So we had, we were living our life and we had a sense of what it meant to be heading forward into the future, making plans. And then when Ellie was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer in the January of 2016, she was given 2 years to live, but by the time 6 months had passed, we knew that she only had a few weeks left. And so suddenly the future is almost empty. There's no sense of what the future is.
Mm.
But the other thing that kind of came into these thoughts was the idea that one thing that strangers do bring us is futures that we couldn't anticipate ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that thing of that tension really between the idea that grief is a loss of the future. It's many things, but one of the things it is a loss of the future, and that strangers bring us unanticipated futures. Was really the central starting point that really pushed me into kind of exploring this in more depth and made it more existentially urgent, I think, in the months and years after Ellie's death.
Absolutely. I love that premise. And before we dive deeper into the conversation, I was wondering if you'd like to share a short excerpt from the book with us.
Yes, so I'll read thank you. I'll read a section from the introduction to the book, and it really says what I've just been trying to say, perhaps with greater clarity, because it's been through editing, which a live talk doesn't go through. And it's about a encounter with a stranger in the very first days after Ellie's death, and that sense of the opening up of the future. Okay. Loss tears a hole in the world. It exposes us, leaves open a rent, a gap. It is disorientating, puts the compass points of our lives in disarray. Loss makes the future impossible because it refers only to the past. But loss is never total, and sometimes into that gap, that rent, the breeze of newness can blow. And in the acknowledgement of our brokenness, in the softness of it, a stranger reaches out to embrace you, and in this embrace, there is a bridge to something new. The relationship to the stranger, the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas once wrote, is a relationship with the future. Several days after Ellie's death, I was walking down the high street. My bike had been stolen from outside the station, and I was raging inwardly at the thief's inconsiderate timing. To the thief who stole my bike, I posted on Facebook, you could have chosen a better time. You could have chosen a better bike. In the street, I was stopped by a stranger, a charity fundraiser. She was in her 20s and had an open, optimistic face. Hi, she said. You look like a friendly person. Can you spare a minute? I hesitated. I saw the logo on her tabard. She was fundraising for breast cancer research. Do you know much about breast cancer? She asked. I could have lied. I could have brushed her off. I felt a constriction in my throat. But then I thought I might as well tell the truth. Yes, I said. My partner died in the hospice earlier this week. The stranger paused to take this in. What was her name? She asked. The question surprised me. It was the simplest of questions, and it seemed like a gift. Ellie, I said. She smiled and reached out to touch my arm. You need a hug, she told me. Then she put her arms around me and squeezed me hard, her plastic tabard crackling. A hug of solidarity, a shared acknowledgement of the difficulty of living. Thank you, I said, crying into her shoulder, utterly overwhelmed. Thank you so much.
There's something about that idea of a stranger's hug that rings especially true and almost nostalgic in a pandemic. And I'll come back to the idea of the pandemic later in the conversation. Thank you so much for that excerpt, Will. And I think it really gives our audience a flavor for how vivid the storytelling is. This is in many ways a book about strangers, but I would say it's also a book about place and a book about home. And indeed, soon after Ellie's death, you got on the road, which in some ways you had been doing your whole life. So the book moves through Birmingham and Norfolk and Yangon and Thessaloniki and all sorts of places. And so I was curious if you'd tell us a little bit about what got you on the road initially and what kept you on the road, because sometimes what gets us going isn't the same thing that sustains an itinerant lifestyle.
I think it was, I think Bruce Chatwin says somewhere that whenever he was traveling, he always sort of longed for home, and when he was at home, he always longed to be elsewhere. I'm not quite like that, but I can appreciate that sort of double desire. So the desire for rootedness, if you like, and the more restless desire to see what's over the horizon. My first real experience of being far from home and being on my own far from home was in Pakistan. And I talk a lot about that in the book, because one of the big themes in the book is obviously hospitality, is how we open our lives and our homes to strangers. And my experience of hospitality in Pakistan was hugely transformative. I was an 18-year-old kid, incredibly naive, really quite vulnerable, and it didn't have to go well, but actually it did go well, and I was treated incredibly well and welcomed into people's homes, into people's lives, in a way that I initially found quite difficult and challenging, but in a way that did, I think, transform my sense of what it meant to interact with strangers. As I went on with writing the book, I started to think that maybe that dichotomy between home and elsewhere isn't isn't necessarily as strong as all that. So I was thinking a lot in the book about how we might make our homes more porous, how they might be less shored up against the world, less like little fortresses, and more with a sense of coming and going. And then the other side of the book is actually thinking about how we might find ourselves at home, places where we don't necessarily expect. So I think there's that sort of tension really between being at home and being elsewhere, or what's intimate and familiar and what's strange, is an interesting one. But in a way, the book, and as I started thinking more and more about these themes, I started seeing that tension blurring a bit. And actually, a lot of the interesting stuff is when things begin to blur as well.
Yeah, I love how you put that, the idea of porous homes, and in many ways we both embody that. I'm dialing in tonight from Dunblane, Scotland, and you're in Dundee, and the festival's in Paisley, and these are chosen homes for us in a string of other chosen homes. And so I'm curious about these ideas of home for people of multiple homes. The book quotes a lot of wisdom. There are a lot of voices besides your own in this book. And one is that of the anthropologist Fran Barone, who says, "Home is not merely a place. It is a lived experience bound with space, proximity, love, togetherness, doing, and making." And I'm curious about how your encounters with strangers and your own itinerant life and chosen homes, as well as homes of origin, have informed your understanding and definition of home.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think the thing that I start talking about in the book when I'm talking about home, and it was a hugely formative experience, was growing up in a home that was effectively a public building. So I was brought up in a vicarage in rural Norfolk, and it was porous in all senses. There was the heating, the heat seeped out in winter, the cold and damp seeped in. That it was always full of kind of wood lice and things that scuttled in corners. It was actually an old police station that had been converted into a vicarage in small town Norfolk. But also people came and went all the time. So there was that sense of a blurring between public and private space from really quite early on. And I think I've always sought out places to live in, and it's one of the reasons I like being a stranger myself. Always sought out places to live in where there is that sense of porosity and almost a bunch of people together, but finding different ways of being at home. There's a lovely image in Tove Jansson's Tales from Moomin Valley, which I did put in the book and was, in the edits. Inevitably, you lose stuff, but there's a lovely description of the Moomin house in Tove Jansson's children's books as a place where all of these curious characters turn up, and they find Moomin Mama, who's the sort of matriarch, finds room for them and puts another leaf in the table. And they're all a little bit weird, and they're all a little bit strange, and occasionally they might be a little bit unsettling as well. But at the same time, it's kind of communal and collective and interesting as well. And I think she ends this little beautiful description of this hospitable space by saying, and at least nobody had time to get bored, and that's a good thing. So that's the image. I always think about the Moomin house as an image of home where people can belong in multiple ways, and that's okay.
I love that. And I love Tove Jansson, particularly the winter book for those who live in Scotland and for whom it's still winter is highly recommended. One important aspect of making a home, but also encountering strangers, is ritual. And you write a lot and beautifully about ritual in the book. So you go through a lot of welcome rituals that people extended to you. And many of these are quite choreographed and quite formal. Is there a particular welcoming ritual that stands out to you in your memory?
That's a really interesting question. I'm just trying to think. I do talk at one point in the book about my friend Hasan Yakub Hasan, who is a Turkish Bulgarian guy who now lives in the UK but was living in Omurtag in the center of Bulgaria. And I turned up with a friend of his, and he wasn't a friend at the time, but the welcome he gave us and the way he sort of readjusted his day and his household around giving us some food, and then regaling us with stories, as a story I tell in the book about the darker side of hospitality, perhaps, that he told us, but regaling us with stories about hospitality whilst enacting hospitality, giving us some beautiful food. And the degree of care there, and the degree of, I think, the thing that I really remember about that was the extent to which it was an unanticipated visit. And the immediate response being, okay, this is an unanticipated visit, but how can we embrace this and make this a place and a situation of welcome? And that remains really close to my heart.
It's funny you say that. I grew up in Thessaloniki, Greece, which I was delighted to find actually makes a significant cameo in the book itself as a place. And growing up, my mother always had a guest cake, an unanticipated guest cake that we in the family were not allowed to eat. It was a just-in-case cake, in case people showed up.
Yes,
and it really tells you something about hospitality and strangers and ritual in that part of the world, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
I also loved what you had to say about departure rituals. And you quoted different anthropologists. I favor the anthropologist being one myself, Kate Fox, who says, for the English, departures are a mess of awkward embarrassment. So tell us about the idea of the departure ritual, and if you have any favorites among those you encountered.
I think the departure rituals are interesting because one of the things I'm interested in the book is the fact that our relationships with strangers are not easy. And there's the doubleness. So I talk about xenophobia, which is etymologically the fear of strangers or strangeness, and the opposite, the Greek philoxenia, which is the kind of friendship with, the sense of wanting to connect with what's strange and what is unfamiliar. And I think we have both of those things. to different degrees, but you're sitting in a station cafe and somebody walks past and you find yourself smiling at them, or they find themselves smiling at you, and then there's this awkwardness and difficulty because you're caught between, oh dear, this is a stranger, I kind of don't want to connect, and that, oh, but who are they? What's going on? So in all our encounters, I think we have that doubleness. And that's one of the reasons I think why ritual is so important for managing strangers. And it's a way of, and it's not just human beings who do this, but I talk about lemurs who do this, who play ritually with lemurs who aren't their friends, to kind of test them out and get a sense of who is this lemur who's just rocked up, and could they become a friend, or are they somebody I need to be careful with? So we all do this all the time, this gauging through ritual means, I think, who we're dealing with. And that can make being a guest in particular, and I find being a guest always much harder than being a host, but being a guest can feel quite perilous. And one thing that's nice about departure rituals is that after you leave, very soon you're going to be free again. They're going to be free of you, and this is and hopefully everything has gone well and no disasters have happened. So I see departure rituals as they're partly celebratory, but I think they also look back on the relationship you've had, and they can sometimes redeem even quite a difficult relationship. So a good departure, a good send-off, when you're staying with somebody, can redeem quite a difficult situation. There's a story, again, not in the book, but Ellie and I we couch surfed a lot. So there was a hospitality website where you stay in people's homes for free, and they put you up, and it's just a way of connecting with people. And we stayed with two French sisters in Paris, and we got off on the wrong foot because we gave them some of those Bouja Bouja chocolates they have in the UK. And they come in this round box that looks exactly like a camembert box. And I don't know if this was the reason, but we gave them this gift, and they looked, and they see camembert, it's a camembert. And then they opened it and saw chocolates inside. And I think they just thought it was weird. And somehow it was not quite an appropriate gift, and they put it on a very high shelf and then looked at us awkwardly. And that set the tone for 2 or 3 days of awkwardness. But on the final day, we then had a little gathering. Some of their friends came over, and before we left the morning after, we bought them some flowers, and they beamed with the delight of a host who knows that their guests are leaving and weren't as bad as they feared, and that we've maintained a good connection to the end, despite perhaps the mutual fears. So I think that's departure rituals have a really powerful function looking back, but also looking forward, because obviously you want to give people a good send-off, because who knows what they'll say when they're out in the world, roaming around and telling the secrets of your household, your home, or whatever.
Yeah, I love that idea. And if David Attenborough is watching, I would absolutely watch a program on lemurs' departure and welcome rituals. For those of you who aren't David Attenborough, please do post your questions in the chat, and we'll be picking them up as we go along.
Please do, David. Yeah.
Will, I wanted to pick up on something you just said about why it's so much harder to be a guest than it is to be a host. And I found it interesting and honest that in a book about the joy, for the most part, of encountering strangers, you talk about how sometimes you just want to be in a hotel by yourself. Why do you think that is? Why do you think it's harder to be a guest than a host?
I mean, partly it's hard to not be on your own ground. You don't know the rules, you don't know the parameters. of the place you're in. There's a Kazakh saying in the book, a ghost sits and notices a lot. A guest sits, right, ghost. A guest sits and notices a lot. And I think you do have to sit and notice, and there's always the fear that something will go terribly wrong, and you won't even know why it's gone terribly wrong. And particularly if you're a long way from your home culture and you're somewhere that's quite unfamiliar, there's also the challenge that you're in the middle of a shared culture where you don't fully know the signs, and there's always a risk of misreading them. So I think that demonstrating you are a good guest as well is much more complicated thing, because you're also demonstrating gratitude, but also doing the things a guest should do. Demonstrating you're a good host, well, you just give people food, you give them a nice, warm, safe place to sleep. If they're allergic to cats, you put the cat out. If they like cats, you introduce them to the cat, and it's all quite straightforward in some ways, being a host. But being a guest always feels much harder because you're in a world you're unfamiliar with and you're trying to learn the rules of that world.
Absolutely. I think what you're really touching on there is that being a guest and being a host is performative, but in different ways. And in a sense, the performance of the host is more obvious, whereas a guest is meant to be at ease and enjoying themselves. And as anyone who has ever been a guest knows, that takes a whole lot of pleasantly arranging your face and complimenting the food.
Yes.
And the such. I'm also struck by the fact that in the introduction, you talk about this being a book about the hope for newness strangers bring with them. And I'm assuming nearly all your readers read this book during a pandemic, when strangers bring fears, not necessarily hope for newness. And so my next question echoes what I see is also an audience question, which is for those of us who have lost confidence in hosting others during the pandemic, and I would broaden this audience question to encountering others. How do we go about reclaiming that role and opening our doors again? Or put another way, how do we not fear strangers?
I think that's something I've thought a lot about, because I've noticed how, after lockdown and just the idea of going and meeting people in person is harder. The resistance is greater. And I think that's a really common experience. I think the other thing is there is absolutely no obligation. I mean, there are some people I know who are quite some natural hermits for whom the liberation from the obligation to go out and meet people has been one sort of unexpected sort of silver lining of what has been a fairly horrific couple of years otherwise. But I think, so how that mix of that blend of xenophobia in the sense of fear of strangers and philoxenia, how that is blended in each of us individually is, well, very, very much individual. But I think the thing that I've been telling myself really is that I've just been noticing that curiosity and telling myself that matters as well, and giving it a bit more space. And also thinking, well, if I stay at home, I generally know what will happen. And I used to do this when I was much younger, and I am quite shy actually. And I'd be invited to a party, and I think, well, I don't really want to go to a party, but I don't really want to stay at home here on my own. And I think, well, okay, if you stay at home, you will know how the evening will go. Make dinner, you'll hang out with your housemates, maybe read a book, maybe watch something, go to bed. And that's all fine. But if you go to this party, well, you don't know what's going to happen. There's something unanticipated. And I try to sort of develop or cultivate a taste for what might be unanticipated, and to remind myself that the unanticipated is definitely not always bad. And more often than not, in those kind of situations, it's likely to be more life enhancing and more broadening, even if it's tricky to navigate.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you're suggesting we need to redevelop our taste and tolerance for surprise, and the pace at which we each do that obviously depends on our individual circumstances in the pandemic, but you've certainly made it sound appealing, and that represents a lot of possibility for us, I think.
Yeah, I think also just recognizing, oh, I am actually a little bit curious. And if you stop imagining the worst, well, what else could it be? And generally speaking, when I imagine something's going to be terrible, it's fine. And when I don't think about it and imagine it's going to be fine, or don't even imagine at all, that's when the terrible things happen. So we're very bad at actually anticipating what the unexpected or the unknown future is going to be.
Yes, absolutely. Speaking of the unexpected and the unknown future, I wanted to ask about strangers and the internet. In many ways, this is a very analog book. The reader sits with you in Pakistan, in Greece, in Bulgaria, in England. And I'm curious about how the concepts of the book, the ideas about encountering strangers, what strangers bring to our lives, map onto your relationship with the internet. Do you think about strangers differently on the internet? And how does it open up possibilities or hold dangers or both when it comes to encountering strangers?
What I personally like about the internet is that it's a way of building connections that don't necessarily turn into analog connections, but a lot of them may do. And I have a lot of friends who I know through Twitter,
Yes.
and then I've got to know them, and then we're now good friends, and people I've done fun sort of projects with as well through the internet, and also the whole couch surfing thing I talk about in the book, which and that sort of era of online hospitality websites, which Ellie and I were involved in, was a crossover from the digital to the analog. So that's one of the things I like about the internet. And we were chatting beforehand, because you're down the road and you're saying, "Oh, well, I'll have to call by sometime," because you're St Andrews, I'm Dundee, and that's all lovely. I love all that. I think I'm not too exercised by those digital analog distinctions, actually. And it is something I did think about when writing the book. And do I need a chapter on the internet? But maybe that would have been an interesting thing to talk about. And I'm sure there's lots of interesting things you could say about how people present themselves on the internet, and whole PhDs, whole careers, academic careers about this. But I think it's not. Our basics of evolved responses to strangers are very much the same. And that cocktail of fear and curiosity. And the internet does weird stuff with all of that, of course. But I think that basic tremor of uncertainty and curiosity is the same.
Yeah, and I love how you put that, the idea of the online stranger turned friend is such a niche generational experience. As someone who also came of age in the couch surfing era, and I have friends I met on the internet, and I talk about them as friends from the blogging era, and I realize in many ways that is a different way to mark not only place but also time. I'm not making new friends in the blogging era, and a lot of us make enemies on Twitter, so it's an interesting.
That's also true, yes, and Twitter can be horrific as well, and there's all that side.
Absolutely. I noticed one of our audience members actually has a question on this question of generations. So they ask, do you think young people have a fundamentally different relationship with meeting others than previous generations? It feels like some teenagers are afraid to meet people in real life now. What's your take on that?
I mean, I'd hesitate to form a view about this. I've taught students in various places for years, and I think probably COVID has had an effect. And I think also, at quite formative stages, to then suddenly find yourself stripped of quite intense social contact that you would have. I can't imagine what that would be like, and I can see that could be very difficult. But I mean, the answer is I don't know. But my hunch is that generally people are different, but there are cultural ideas about strangers which are, I think, which overemphasize questions of risk and danger. But at the same time, I think that most of my students and people I've sort of taught and worked with, my sense is that everyone has that kind of that combination of curiosity and hesitation.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. And I think this question that our audience member asked in our discussion on the internet points us in a totally different direction than, in many ways, the texts that you draw on in the book. I would say if this book were a person, I would call them an old soul. There's a lot of the Odyssey. There are a lot of philosophers. As I said, this is a book crowded in beautiful ways with voices other than your own. And so I'm curious as to why you turned to these often ancient texts. What do you think they brought to your understanding of strangers, and how did they inform it?
The text I return to a lot is the Odyssey. And it might look from reading the book as if I've spent my life contemplating the Odyssey, but actually I remember maybe 5 years ago when I was thinking about this book, one of my colleagues said to me, "Oh, you need to go back and read the Odyssey." And I thought, well, I can't remember if I've actually read the whole thing or not. I don't know if it's going back or if it's or reading from scratch. And she told me several times that I needed to read the Odyssey. And I nodded sagely. And she knows ancient Greek, and she's very wise. But I thought, I don't need to do that. And then it just started. The more I pulled at these threads, the more I found a lot of them did go back to the Odyssey, and that particularly that text opened up all kinds of really difficult, troubling questions about strangers. So in some ways, it was the book that led me back to some of those texts. I mean, by training, I'm a philosopher, so I do like to burrow into old texts as well. And there's also I've had a long-standing interest in Chinese philosophy in particular, and there is a delight, I think, and it is to do with that encountering strangeness and strangers as well. There is a delight in picking your way through a text in Chinese, classical Chinese, when you don't know it very well, and finding these beautiful sort of arguments and perspectives that are quite different from your own, but that you can get into dialogue with. So it is also partly an encounter with strangers and strangeness. It's another way of doing that, I think.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. This is just another reminder to our audience to pop your questions in the chat box on whichever platform you're watching, and we'll fold them into the conversation as we go. Another thing I was struck by in the book is how powerfully you write about restlessness. And you write at some point, restlessness is not a problem to solve, but something to embrace. And I know we have lots of itinerant souls joining us tonight who would be curious to know, have you embraced it? And if so, how?
I think in the context of the book, I spent about a decade practicing quite seriously as a Buddhist. And one of the hindrances to meditation is restlessness and anxiety. And it was always the big one for me. I sit down to meditate and wanting to be off elsewhere. And I think that is there is a sense of just individual character there. I always like knowing what's over the next hill or around the next corner. But the more as I sort of practiced meditation and practiced Buddhism and thought about this idea of restlessness, I began to wonder if it is always a vice that you need to eradicate. And I think we do live in a culture in many ways that privileges staying still, and that thinks that's somehow more virtuous. So if your restlessness is perhaps, I'm not sure this is the case, but it feels to me as if restlessness is associated more with frivolity and sort of ungroundedness, and being grounded is good and serious, and being serious is good because it's grounded, and it's kind of a circular argument. So I think that cultural valuing of staying put and stillness it doesn't really have necessarily an ethical weight. We're curious little mammals, we like to kind of snuggle into a corner and be still and quiet and have nobody interfere with us. But also we like to be, poking around and exploring stuff. You can see this if you've got a cat. They're both restless and quite rooted, and I think we're similar. And what I struggle with is putting moral weight on either of those, actually.
Yeah, I think you're definitely onto something with how culture privileges rootedness. Just thinking about how hard it is to manage things like bank accounts, or where is your mailing address?
That's one of the big reasons we moved back from Bulgaria to Dundee, to establish a base. So Hannah, my partner, and I, so we can then do stuff elsewhere and continue to be restless, but without the bureaucratic horror of having no address.
Yes, I know that bureaucratic horror better than I'd like to admit. So tell us about the pull for roots then. What is the appeal of establishing a base, and how do you learn to do that when you've had to unlearn it while being on the road? And how do you encounter strangers when you do have a base and you are rooted, as opposed to being the traveler yourself?
I think there's lots of ways of being at home, and it's one of the things I talk about a lot in the book. And the idea that our homes are single, that may be the case for some of us, but I think most people I know are at home in multiple places if they think about it, and multiple contexts. So rootedness is not it's not once and for all. The view of it sometimes, I find my roots, and there's just one set of roots, and they're here, and they're not moving anywhere. But I think if that's you, then in some ways that kind of feels like it might be enviable. Yes. But I don't know. But I think for many people, it's more a process of finding ways of connecting more deeply with your environment and the people around you, and finding ways of moving. And so there's those two processes, I think, rather than being rooted or just being restless. It's kind of negotiating between connecting and building up something with more substance, and also the sense of energy and movement. In Dundee, it's been incredibly easy to come back down to earth, because I was getting a bit sort of woolly and philosophical there. It's been incredibly easy because Dundee is just an exceptionally friendly city. So we strolled into the second week here, pub, and it looked a bit intimidating at first, until the old guy who was sitting there, who looked a bit intimidating, told us to sit down, and then introduced himself and got chatting. and started, telling us about all the things we should know about the area. And it is a really easy place to connect. So I think in terms of how I manage it personally, it's, I think, less in terms of rootedness and more in terms of connection. I think maybe even love. So, developing a love for a landscape and for people and for the curious paths that you track through the place that you are. And that I think does feel important to me. But that may be in several places as well. So, in the summer we'll be back in Sofia, and we'll be back tracking those same paths and connecting with those same landscapes. That is a kind of rootedness elsewhere as well. So yeah, you have many roots, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. That definitely resonates with me. And I'm going to pick up on a couple of questions in the chat box on the same theme. One person wants to know, what about people who cannot get out to travel and meet new people? How can they overcome that restlessness and need to explore?
I think one reason that Ellie and I started couch surfing back in the very early days of couch surfing was because we'd moved to a small not semi-detached terrace house to the west of Birmingham. We had a cat, we had a garden, we were surrounded by people pretty much like ourselves who had their cat in their garden, sort of, couples of various kinds living in the street. And that was all fine. And we looked at each other in horror and just thought, but where's the newness? And so then we went online and we signed up for couch surfing, and we had guests coming in and out and staying, and gave them the keys and they let themselves into our home. And that was just absolutely delightful. And I remember thinking back then, this feels like traveling without having to travel. And so I think many people actually find strategies for encountering strangers and newness and strangeness without, you don't have to go to Ulaanbaatar to do that. You can just stroll down the road, particularly if you're in Dundee, because people say hello. I'm bigging up Dundee here, but seriously, it's great. If you're wondering where to put down your temporary roots, and anybody who's listening, come to Dundee. But I think because we're so outnumbered by strangers, because pretty much everybody's a stranger, other than that, 150 people we can keep track of, according to the anthropologist Robin Dunbar. We've got loads of options to connect. All you have to do is peer out of the window, lean over the fence, go out into the street, and actually you're almost certain to run into a stranger.
Absolutely. The tourism board should definitely pay you dividends while you're doing the recruitment for Dundee and for Scotland. As someone fairly new to Scotland, I can vouch for that sense of warmth and openness and generosity. And I would say book festivals for me were a great way to meet people. I remember being brand new here and going to an event at the Glasgow Women's Library by myself and feeling, okay, I have found my people, and just chatting to people about cake and books. So if you're in Scotland, book festivals are a great way to meet people. If you're not, please move here. Another question that people are asking is, where's the place or culture you've traveled to which has the best sense of connectedness within communities, or perhaps hospitality? Tricky one, that one, huh?
I think this is a tricky one. And one reason it's a tricky one is because it also depends on who you are. So there are many places where, and here questions like gender and race and class come into it big time. And there are places where I know I've been welcomed, where if I was Black or if I was of from somewhere else, in terms of my nationality, I might not have been welcomed in the same way. But the place I would have to mention, and I think was my former home of Leicester, and so nothing too exotic, but Leicester is an extraordinary, I think, example of a culture where there was an article in Vice around the time that Leicester won whatever they won, big football game. I don't know about football. They won something. Everyone was happy. I was happy. I was interested in football for about a week because Leicester won, and that was great. And loads of reporters descend on Leicester, and somebody came from Vice and went up and down the Harbour Road where I lived, which was very sort of culturally diverse area, talking to people about what makes Leicester different, because it seemed like a place where people are welcomed and there are lots of ways of belonging. And I think that's the key thing, that multitude of ways of belonging. And the article ended by saying something like, Leicester seemed like a place where people just don't hate each other.
Oh.
Which was lovely, and also slightly romanticizing, and obviously there are social problems everywhere. But I do think that Leicester in lots of ways was an exemplary place for that multitude of ways of belonging to it. At the celebration for that very important football thing that I am now embarrassing myself by having forgotten, but 250,000 people turned out. Premier League, it's probably the Premier League, let's go with that. 250,000 turned out to celebrate, and we went down as well, Ellie and I, and it was a real sense of pretty much everybody who lived there. And I remember seeing somebody in their Kurdish national dress with their Leicester flag, and huge diversity of communities there. It's one of the most multicultural cities in the UK, but it also seems to do it well. So yeah.
I love that. I love the idea of a place where people don't seem to hate each other. And I agree, it's probably romanticized, but it's also quite aspirational, right?
Yeah.
I want to live there. I want to make a home
Yeah.
at such a place. This is probably our audience's last chance to ask a question. So if you have a burning question, please pop it in the chat box now, or forever hold your peace. And while you do that, I'm going to ask Will about chemistry. The idea of chemistry with strangers, and what is it that makes some encounters work but others not, really runs through the book. And I found it particularly funny. You quote Immanuel Kant on what makes for the perfect dinner party. And so Kant says the perfect dinner party should have between 3 and 9 guests, no fewer than the Graces and no more than the Muses. That's a pretty rigid prescription.
It is
I'm
Kant.
curious. It is, right? It is. And, speaking of someone who never left home in some ways, but really traveled quite broadly intellectually in others. And so I'm curious, what's your own sense of chemistry? I'm assuming it's not quite as formulaic or rigid, but when it comes to those magical moments with strangers, what separates them from the rest?
I think, again, one of the big themes in the book is the theme of play. And when something is going right, I think it's that sense of play and mutual fun, and that's the time where you think, oh, this is great. Here I am with these people who I hadn't expected to meet, and it's all totally unexpected, but this is also exactly what I want to be doing, even though I didn't know it half an hour ago or yesterday or last week. So I think play, but also, I don't talk about it so much in the book, fun is something that we tend to not take that seriously, or get very sort of gloomy in our analyses of it. But I think that kind of lightness and delight is really you can't really always anticipate it, but when it's there, that's when you think, yeah, this is when that sort of philoxenia is really in overdrive, and your natural xenophobic impulses, they've been put to one side, and this is where we're really connecting, and this is where we're finding new possibilities.
Yes, absolutely. I think whimsy is one of the loveliest words in the English language. You
I
keep
do
telling
like
us,
a bit of whimsy.
right? Couple of last questions as we wrap up. Maybe a quick round of them. One person wants to know, will you be hosting couch surfers from your new home in Dundee?
We may well do. We at the moment we don't have a bed in this room, which is a spare room, but we've just got a sofa bed from the second-hand furniture emporium, another delight of Dundee, which is being delivered this very week, which is very excited about. And it has felt as if not having the capacity to make guests comfortable, even though we've only been here 4 or 5 weeks, has felt as if our home has been a little bit not quite as much of a home as it should be.
Right on. Absolutely. When I moved here, it didn't really feel like we truly lived here until we had our first guest.
Yeah.
It's almost like your home becomes more your own when someone else sleeps
Yes.
in it.
Yeah. I mean, thankfully, we like 2 days after we moved in, a old housemate of mine from years ago came rocking past in his van from further north in Scotland. So he stayed a couple of nights, and that did really feel like it cemented our sense of being at home as well, I think.
Yes, absolutely. In Greece, we have a word for it, podariko. It's a first footing ritual, the first person to enter
Yes.
your home
Mm.
after you purchase it or after you move
Mhm.
in. Will, it's been a delight to use
It's
your
a
words
pleasure.
chatting. This was Will Buckingham. His book, Hello Stranger, is available on bookshop.org along with other books at the festival. And we ask you to please also fill in an online evaluation, which will be emailed to you after the event and also posted in the live chat on YouTube. I'd also like to thank Associate Programmer Jess Orr, who has really, truly pulled miracles with this
Yeah,
year's
seriously.
festival, as have volunteers and everyone involved with the Paisley Book Festival as part of Future Paisley. And I would, of course, like to thank all of you, strangers and friends, for joining us tonight. Thank you, Will, for the wonderful chat, and I hope we have the chance to meet in real life.
Thank you
Until
so
then,
much.
good night to all.
Good night.